Hello. Lori, can you hear me?
I can. Hello.
Hi, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Nedra?
Good, exciting day. It is launch day.
It is. It's the book birthday.
It is
So
the
happy
book
birthday to the
birthday.
workbook. Yes.
Yes. So tell everyone why the workbook, why now, and how did you feel about writing such a wonderful workbook to follow up such an amazing book? Because I've had the opportunity to use it the past few weeks and it's really good. So tell us about why and the process for you.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I wrote Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, I never thought about writing a workbook. And a lot of people wondered if the book itself, if Maybe You Should Talk to Someone was supposed to be sort of self-help. And to me, it wasn't really self-help. I think a lot of people ended up being helped by it, which was my goal. But it wasn't one of these things with kind of like bullet points and takeaways and things like that. It was more of an experience than a blueprint. And after the book came out, so many people underlined and highlighted themes and passages and quotes that spoke to them and ideas that resonated with them. And they posted them on their bathroom mirrors or above their desks. And a lot of people kept writing to me and saying, please make a workbook where I can take all of these things that have resonated with me and apply them in a kind of systematic way to my life. And I didn't really want to do it in that way. I didn't really want to kind of just pull the themes out of the book or pull quotes out of the book. I wanted to, if I was going to do a workbook, I wanted to really give people the experience of how I work with people in the therapy room. And so I just hadn't come up with it and decided I don't really want to do a workbook unless, as you know, from reading the book, unless it's meaningful, because
Mhm.
that's what led to writing Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. And then later that year, I did a TED Talk. I was asked to do a TED Talk, and I was asked to write about this theme that came from Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which is about how we're all unreliable narrators and how often what gets in our way are these faulty narratives that we're stuck in. And how, because I have a writing background, I feel like a lot of that is something that I use in the therapy room to really help people to edit their stories. And when I did that TED Talk and it went viral, I thought that's the workbook. That's finally the kind of workbook that I would want to use myself, that I do use myself. I've actually used my own workbook as I was writing it to kind of, see what it would be like to go through that experience. And
Mhm.
so, the workbook to me is really an opportunity for people to kind of put together and synthesize their experience of Maybe You Should Talk to Someone and apply it to their own lives. But it also is a standalone. It's also something that you can do even if you haven't read Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, because it's very much, I think, what I do in the therapy room. I'm sure a lot of what you do in the therapy room too, is to help people examine things from a different perspective, to really help them to understand more about what it means to have agency in their lives, what it means to be the protagonist in their lives, and how to untangle themselves from these kind of narrative traps that they're in.
Mhm. Yes. So what do you hope people will get from this book?
I hope what they'll get is a better understanding of themselves. I feel like in Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, the reader is in conversation with all of the patients, and I include myself as one of those patients. And I feel like in the workbook, they're really in conversation with themselves. And so I really want people to, a lot of people want to do this work, but they need some kind of guide. They need some kind of system. And I feel like this is sort of like a toolkit for them to say, this is the process, but also here's a way to do this. Because I think, you and I as therapists, we know a lot about sort of timing and dosage, right? So somebody comes in, we might think, oh, I want to go there with them, but I also know
Mhm.
they probably aren't ready. I just met them.
Mhm.
And so, how do we get people ready? And so the workbook goes through this process in a way that I feel like helps them get ready for certain exercises at certain times. So we start off with sort of the stories of our feelings. And then we go into much more depth around, the bigger stories and how those initial stories um, really inform how we're moving through the world. And so I hope that what people get from this is they get the experience that I really want to create access. I think that, you do this through your books, and I do this through mine. And I think, through this, I have a podcast called Dear Therapist, where you can actually hear people in session. I just want to bring therapy outside of the therapy room and onto people's nightstands, into their earbuds, however it's going to get to them, so that more people have access.
I love that you mentioned access, because although therapy is becoming less taboo, there are still so many challenges with access, and workbooks, books, listening to podcasts from therapists. Those are wonderful ways to have some level of access to the tools. I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about narrative therapy, because I absolutely love it. The stories that we tell ourselves. What are some of the common stories that you hear that are barriers for people?
I think there are two kinds of stories that are barriers for people. I think there are the stories that have been told to us about us. And so maybe when we were younger, some adult in our lives said, you're so sensitive, or you're too this, or, whatever the story was, or the labels, right? Like, you're the smart one, you're the pretty one, you're the this, you're, whatever you are. And those stories get internalized, even if they're not accurate, or even if they're just a little piece of something. And so oftentimes when we're adults and we're still carrying those stories, we start to realize, wait a minute, that story that was told to me about me, like I'm too sensitive, that was really something about the storyteller. The storyteller didn't do well with feelings. The storyteller got very activated by a child who had feelings that were normal feelings. Right. So that ended up being a story about me, but really it was a story about the adult who told that story to me. And so I think to disentangle, who is telling the story and whose story was it? And how did we start to make that story our own, even though it's not really true about us? And then there are the stories that we tell ourselves, like, and I was just about to say the story of, like, you have this choice of, I'm unlovable or I'm lovable, right? So those are two very different stories that somebody will walk through the world with. The person who walks through the world with the story of I'm inherently lovable is going to have a different reaction in the world. People are going to react differently to that person than the person who walks through the world with the story of I'm inherently unlovable, or I'm hard to love, or I'm too much, or whatever it might be. And it's interesting that I noticed in therapy that when people have a choice, when they have evidence for both, like they have evidence of, there are people who think that they're very lovable and maybe think people who they're not their cup of tea, whatever it is. We tend to choose the story that makes us feel bad. There's something about that, right? And so in the workbook, I really help people to look at these stories and examine which stories are you paying attention to and why. Because it's not so binary. It's not so cut and dried. It's like these stories, like any story, they're messy, they're complicated. And I think we have to make room for the entirety of the story. So the provenance of the stories, where did they come from? Who's telling them? Whose point of view is it? And then, is it true? Does it ring true today? And why are you focusing more on certain evidence than other kinds of evidence?
How do you stop people from getting stuck in those stories? How do you keep them away from the narratives that are not supporting who they want to be?
I think that the reason I wanted to write the workbook is because it's one thing to know that you have a story that is not serving you. It's another to be able to move forward and try to kind of rewrite that story, edit that story. And so I think you have to go through, there are 6 chapters in the workbook. And I want to say it's called a workbook, the word work is in there because it is work. And I love that about this workbook, because I think you have to do some work, and it's not work in the sense of you don't want to do it. It's work that it's going to challenge you to ask questions about yourself that maybe you haven't been asking. In the therapy room, we always say that, the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion, that our friends give us idiot compassion, which is like, we say, listen to what happens with my boss, with my partner, with my sibling, with my mother, whatever it is. And we're like, yeah, I can't believe they did that. They're terrible. That was awful. You're right. They were wrong. And if you start to listen to their stories over time, and we all do this, you start to notice that maybe they're telling the same story, maybe different characters, but the same theme keeps coming up where they are wronged. And it's kind of like if a fight breaks out in every bar you're going to, maybe it's you. We don't say that to our friends. We're afraid that they'll feel unsupported. So that's idiot compassion. In wise compassion, we hold up a mirror to you and we help you to see something about yourself that maybe you haven't been willing or able to see. And that's what going through the process of rewriting your story is like. It's sequentially put together so that you can go through this process of starting to ask yourself some questions that will then open you up to the maybe deeper questions that start to come in chapters 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's a process. It's not like there's one thing you can do. It's going through all of these exercises of self-examination where you get to the point where there's no shame, there's no judgment. It just kind of, oh, wow, isn't this interesting? And then what are some other ways that I can think about this story? We as therapists, I know you do this all the time because I've read your book, this reframe, right? Of how do we reframe a situation where it's equally accurate? But it's more healthy. So I think that that's the process that I want people to go through.
We have a question, and the question is, what about if you were invisible and weren't told any story because you got lost in a large family struggling to cope with a parent's alcoholism? So it sounds like that question is coming from someone who didn't receive any validation, any affirmation, and they're unclear what the caregivers thought of them, as if they weren't told anything about themselves. What sort of story do you start to create? I hear a story in the question, but
yes, I was just going to say, I think exactly. I was going to say that I know the story right away. The story is I don't have a story. Your story is, I don't have a story. Your story is, no one saw me. Your story is, I was invisible. That's a story. And so, and so then how does it, what do you do with that to go through life with the story of like, I'm a person who's missing a story? You're not missing a story. That is your story. And then the question is, what do you want to do with that story? And how do you create a different story right now, where you are as an adult? How do you create a story for yourself so that you aren't invisible? So your story becomes something of, I am seen, I am heard, I am understood. How do you create that story now?
I once had a client say to me, no one listens to me. And I said, what do you say? They're like, what? What do you say to people? What are you? Well, they won't listen when I talk. Have you tried talking when they're talking? Have you said, hey, listen to me? And she's like, no, I wouldn't do that because they won't listen. Well, well, if you think they won't listen and you're not saying anything, I guarantee you they won't listen.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll see in couples where you get that a lot, like, you're not listening to me, where they do speak up, but the problem is that they're not actually, they don't know how to listen. So it's, they're kind of always telling the other person, you can't hear me, you're not listening to me. And I always say, how well do you listen to him or her? How well do you listen to them? How well do you listen? But in your case, yes, it's very funny when people have a complaint that they come in with, and I'm guilty of this myself, so I can say it's funny because I've done the same thing, where you have a complaint and people say, well, have you done anything about it? Well, no. It's like, that phrase, help rejecting complainers. Those are the people we all know, help rejecting complainers. They come and they complain about the same thing over and over. And we say, well, what if you do this? Or what if you do that? Or how about this? And they say, yeah, no, that won't work because no, I can't do that because, so they don't really want help, that somehow it's serving them to be in that victim
in
position.
The story.
Yeah, that's the story that they're sticking with.
There's another question here that says, I'm going to paraphrase, but how does the work from your book, is it similar to CBT or how is it different?
Yeah. It's not so much CBT. I think it's really a process of self-reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really almost like, because I have a background as a writer, it's taking you through your own narrative process. And Nedra, you were talking about narrative therapy earlier. I think if anything, it uses more narrative therapy than it does CBT, but it certainly uses reframes from CBT. It certainly uses connections between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So you have that, but it's really, what I like about using a workbook is that you have a written record of what you're doing. So when you go to therapy, you leave the session, we hope that you will use what you learned outside in the world in between the sessions, because therapy is not very useful if you come in and you think that the process is, I'm going to download the problem of the week, or I'm going to talk about this one thing, I'm going to maybe gain some insights, and then I'm going to leave, but I'm not going to think about any of that during the week. We always like to say that insight is the booby prize of therapy, that you can have all the insight in the world, but if you don't make changes between sessions out in the world, the insight is useless. And so I feel like with the workbook, it forces you to kind of, really reflect and have that record where you can look back and you can say, oh, last week I wrote this, and now I think about it differently. It's almost like if you took a Microsoft Word document and you went in and edited it, right? And then the next week you went in and did more editing, right? It's going to look, at the end of that process, it's going to look very different from that first draft. The same thing with the process of going through and writing things down and having that record in the workbook.
Mm-hmm. So we talked a little bit about getting stuck in a story. What about when our story, I don't want to say narcissistic, but our story makes us always the hero or the person who saved the day or the person who is the best person in the room? How do you maybe teach people to gain some realistic insight when their story is of being a superhero?
Yeah. So that's pretty much John in Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, where he thinks that he is smarter than everyone else, knows better than everyone else, takes on the burdens of everybody else because nobody else can quite do it the way he does it. And he's sort of the hero of his own story, but also feels very put upon. And we see that a lot, right? And so, when people come in and they say, I'm doing everything, my question is, why? Why are you doing everything? Because if they won't relinquish some of the things that they're doing, and yet they complain about doing them, then it serves them in some way to be that kind of martyr, to be that person who can then say, I do all this stuff and I get no appreciation, or I do all this stuff. And then, and again, I'm going back to couples a little bit because you can see it in action there. It's one thing when someone comes in and they tell you a story and you say, wow, this person, I feel so bad for them. Look at what they have to do. And then they come in as a couple and the other person says, well, I'll help with that, or I'll do that. Versus, no, it's I have to do it because you won't do it, or you'll do it later, or you won't do it the way I want to do it. And it's sort of like, oh, there's more to the story. So as we talk about revising these stories, I really ask people, one of the exercises in the book, in fact, is to say, how would another person tell this story? There are different places in the book where I say, you just wrote this part of the story. Now I want someone else to narrate this story. How would their version of the story be the same as yours? And how would it be different? And when you can imagine your story from someone else's perspective, it opens up a lot of possibilities. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if there are all these other possibilities, why do I not take them? It's like in Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, there's that moment where I'm with my therapist, Wendell, and he says to me, you remind me of this cartoon, and it's of a prisoner shaking the bars, desperately trying to get out. But on the right and the left, it's open, no bars. So the question is, why do we not see that it's open on both sides? And if we do see it, why do we not walk around the bars? And that's because with freedom comes responsibility. And a lot of times we don't want to take responsibility for our lives. We'd rather just sit in jail and complain. And so I want to get people in this workbook out of jail so that they can walk around the bars. And I want to get them over whatever is holding them back, whatever fears they have, whatever anxieties they have about what it would mean to walk around those bars, so that they can have those choices and have more possibilities.
I would say that you just answered Heidi's question, which was, how can you help those who want to stick to the story of I am a victim, to reframe that story and move forward to a helpful one? I think you just answered that.
I did,
And
but
I
I'll
do.
say one more thing about that.
Okay.
That when someone, sometimes you might have someone in your life like that who is
Mhm.
always coming to you. And when I was just talking about help rejecting complainers, and people say to me, how do I deal with someone like that? Meaning in your life, not in the therapy room. And I always say to people, don't argue with them. If they say that they're a victim and they're stuck and you've tried other things and you've given them all these possibilities and they're not interested in that,
Mhm.
you can just say, yeah, that sucks. And then you start talking about something else. And when they realize that you are no longer going to be that person that they can just complain to, or who that person who's going to like try to fix things for them or whatever it is, when they realize that you are not interested in that role and taking on that role for them, they'll find somebody else to do that with, which is great, takes the burden off of you. But you don't have to invest so much emotional real estate in those people when they're coming to you in that way. You can have a different kind of relationship with those people.
Oh, I want to talk about that for the next 40 minutes. No, I'm joking.
Well, that's your whole book. Actually, that's, if you haven't gotten Nedra's book on boundaries, that is it right there. Like she talks about that in depth. So check it out.
Yeah. I think we get stuck into these cycles with people where their story is, someone is doing something to me, I am being harmed. Don't you hear me how they're hurting me? And what I hear you saying is, you don't have to sign up to listen to the story. Stop buying the tickets and participating in the conversations. You can let them know that, oh, wow, that sounds really tough for you, but also don't give them those solutions or even make them believe that you're interested in hearing more about these stories. So thank you for that.
Right.
Someone
And I
wanted
would
to,
say, sorry, I would just say one more thing, like what you just said brought to mind this idea too about when people send you guilt, right? When people send you anything that you don't want, I always say to people, they'll say, oh, this person makes me feel so guilty that I don't do this, that, and the other thing for them, or I don't call them enough, or I don't, whatever it is. And I say, just because someone sends you guilt doesn't mean you have to accept delivery. You don't have to sign for the package. So when somebody, brings you all of their complaints, you don't have to sign for the package. You don't have to
mhm,
accept delivery.
mhm. So there are a few questions about, who is this workbook for? Is it for adolescents? Could it be for a person who is experiencing some sort of psychosis? Who would you say the ideal reader would be for the workbook?
Yeah, I really wanted the workbook to be for everybody, in the sense of, I think that stories are how we make sense of our lives. We all have a story, even as we saw earlier, people who think they don't have a story, there's a story. I think that the people who will benefit most from the workbook are people who are self-reflective, people who are curious about themselves, the same people who maybe would want to maybe come to therapy, but you don't have to come to therapy. I think it's the people who say, like, I want to learn more about myself. I want to learn more about myself in relationship to myself, in relationship to others. Sometimes I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling angry, or I don't know what I'm feeling. And I want to get a better understanding of what all these feelings mean, and how to, help create a story around them that already exists, but I don't know it exists. And then what do I do with this story? So, I think it's most suited for the kinds of people who are interested in, maybe you should talk to someone. Very similar.
Mhm. Um, so there are a few questions about folks with delusion. So you would say this would not be for people who are actively delusional or in a psychotic episode.
No, I don't, until those people are stabilized, I don't think that they're able to do this kind of work, because their stories are fueled by the delusion.
Mhm.
So it would be very difficult to really kind of try to edit a story and in a more objective way when you're having all these intrusive ideas and thoughts. So no, I would say definitely this is for people who are, if they're struggling with that they are stabilized and they're wanting to do the work. Certainly people who struggle with that can use the workbook, but they would need to be stabilized first, I think, in order for it to really benefit them.
Is it important for people to read your book before reading the workbook?
No, that was why I decided to do the workbook, because after the TED Talk came out, I realized lots of people got so much out of that TED Talk and many of them had never read the book. So you don't have, so that's why I wanted to do the workbook in the same way, that it can be a standalone. I think you'll get more out of it if you have read Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, because there are references to kind of tying together some of the themes and concepts with the people that you have read about in Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. So if you were attached to John or Julie or Rita or Charlotte or my story in the book, you're going to see examples of how that relates to the concept that I'm talking about in the workbook. And I think that just makes it easier to understand, but you don't have to read Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, the book, to get something out of the workbook.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think this one question is being asked because of your first book, but it is about self-disclosure in the therapeutic space. What are your feelings about it? Do you use it as a therapeutic tool? And could there be any dangers in disclosing more about yourself to a client?
Yeah. So there's a section in Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, the book, about self-disclosure and when it has gone wrong, as well as when it has gone right. And, it's interesting when you're a therapist and you're writing a book that's very personal. With this book, I was told nobody would read this book. So, and this was a book that nobody wanted. And if you read Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, I was supposed to be writing a book about happiness that was making me depressed. And the irony of that was not lost on me. And so I ended up writing this book that I thought, well, if 3 people read it and they get something out of it, great, because everyone said no one wants to read a book about people in therapy, which to me, that wasn't what the book was about. It was a book about the human condition. And it was a book about seeing ourselves reflected in one another's stories.
Mhm.
And so I just, in terms of self-disclosure in the book, I just let it rip. I was very raw. I was very, I don't come off in a flattering light, in the beginning of the book. I'm just telling it how it was. And then I remember when I turned in my book to the publisher, and they were like, oh my gosh, I gave this to so many people. I laughed, I cried, all of this. So I thought, okay, well, maybe more than 3 people will read it. Maybe like, I don't know, 3,000 people will read it. And I thought, well, maybe I should edit myself or clean myself up a little bit, because what if somebody now that I know, sees this, or what if a patient sees this? But I didn't. I decided not to clean myself up at all. So you get the same version of me that you got in that first draft. And, now, over 1 million copies of the book have sold. So like a lot of people have read it. But when my patients have read it, and I didn't tell them, by the way, I've never mentioned my book in therapy unless they have mentioned it. I've never, even when I went on book tour, I never said, I'm leaving to go on book tour. I said, I'm going to be out of the office. Here's who's on call for me. And so I remember when I came back from launching the book, some people, came in and they sat on my couch and they said, so I read your book. And they weren't necessarily interested in the parts of myself, the self-disclosure parts. They were interested in what it meant about us in our relationship, or what it made them think about the work that we're doing together, or how a certain part really resonated with them, and a theme that we had been talking about in their lives. People were not very interested in talking about my life. And so I think, so that's one kind of self-disclosure in a book. But I think in the therapy room, I think we have to be very intentional about self-disclosure, because this is not my therapy session. And I use self-disclosure when I think it will be useful. And the 2 examples that I gave, and Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which were not my examples, but colleagues. One person had a client, and the client's father had died by suicide. And so had the therapist. And the therapist did not disclose that. And made a very intentional decision not to disclose that, because he felt that it would not be helpful to the client and the work that they were doing, and it would create all kinds of blurred issues. In another case, a colleague had a client and the client's son had Tourette syndrome, and the therapist's son also did. And the therapist disclosed that because this person felt incredibly alone in the experience. And it was really helpful to the work that they did. So I think you have to know the situation, that particular client, their psychology, your relationship with that person, and really ask yourself the question, how specifically will this disclosure benefit the client? And if you don't have an answer for that, do not disclose. That is my rule for myself.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I became, I don't like this word, but I'm going to say it, popular on Instagram maybe about 2 or 3 years ago. And the questions that my clients asked, are you going to stop seeing us? Mm-hmm. It was really about them. Like, now that you've done this thing, are you going to stop seeing us? So really, you're right. When you write a book, when you get to this space, it becomes like they see you as more than their therapist, but they certainly are now even more possessive of like, this is my therapist. I want to keep this relationship going. And I think it gives you some street credibility in their eyes. They're like, oh, she really knows what she's talking about now. I'm like, see, I told you, I've been telling you this for 5 years. Now you believe me.
Yes, I actually did notice that there were things that I wrote in the book that I had been saying to certain patients for a very long time. And it was, they were resisting it. And then they read it in the book as if it was the first time that I had ever said that. And it was like, wow, for the last 2 years, I clearly have not been very effective in making this point in the way that I made it in the book. But I think it wasn't that I wasn't effective. It was that it's one thing to see yourself reflected in somebody else's story. So I could say that to Charlotte in the book. And all of a sudden they were like, oh yeah, that sounds really familiar to me. But when you say it to someone directly, we get defensive. We have all kinds of reasons that we don't want to hear it. So it's kind of easier to hear it when it's applied to someone else.
Absolutely. Yeah, the story is not really yours. It's this character's, but you are your own character. What is the boundary between self-disclosure and counter-transference? I think you spoke well to that there is this discernment that you have to use and really know the client and know your intention for doing it, because there are times when we are connecting for ourselves and when we are connecting with our clients for our clients' benefit. When we are connecting for ourselves, like we're in need of something, I would say we're creating a potential transference situation. But if it is to benefit the client, if it is careful, it can be really helpful. There are tons of ways that just the therapist showing up as a human. And this is what I loved about your book. And I think it was hugely popular for this reason, because you showed up as a human being who happens to be a therapist. Many people do not feel like therapists are anything outside of the treatment space. It's almost when I was in 3rd grade, I saw my teacher at Red Lobster. And I flipped out. I'm like, Miss Murchison is here. Like, I was running back to the table. I mean, I was like, oh my gosh, she's out eating.
Yes. Yes, yeah. Like we're not like, sitting we're stuck in amber in our office and we never leave it. Mm-hmm. That's true. There's a chapter, and maybe you should talk to someone, called Embarrassing Public Encounters, which is sort of, what happens when we do encounter people out in the world, because, I say that we're like D-list celebrities, that like nobody knows you except for your patients. Mm-hmm. And to your patients, it's like a celebrity sighting. It's like, oh my God, you're not going to believe who's here. It's my therapist. You can see them telling their friend, like pointing at you. Right. So, there's that. I think in terms of counter-transference, that's why we have consultation groups. That's why I include, and maybe you should talk to someone, the consultation group sessions, because I wanted people to know that this exists. I think that most people who go to therapy think that you go to therapy and you talk to your therapist, and you don't realize that your therapist then talks about cases with other therapists. We don't disclose any identifying information, but we do have these conversations because we want the feedback. And so sometimes in the consultation group, your colleagues can say, oh, that person basically has a sign on their head that says, I am your mother, right? Or I remind you of your mother, or whatever it is, or your father, or your sibling, or whatever. And in that case, that's where your own therapy comes in. That's where you really need to work on whatever it is that our clients are going to trigger us in all different ways. So I think that it's almost disingenuous to pretend that we are not going to have emotional reactions to the content of what our clients bring up. The question is, what do we do with that? And how do we do that in a way that is beneficial to the client, and making sure that we keep our own stuff in our own lane?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was wonderful. What are some common concepts in writing your story? Do you identify characters, conflict, or settings?
Yes, absolutely. Again, I feel like, when you think about where stories come from, where people, even like television series, right? Your favorite television series, people draw from life. That's what makes for the best stories. They always say, truth is stranger than fiction. I think truth is more interesting. And that's where we get good stories. So I think that you have to, when I have people in the workbook examine their stories, we're looking at character, setting, who are the heroes and who are the villains, and is it really so clear cut? The major characters, the minor characters. There's a part in the book called the supporting characters and the unsupporting characters. And I think we all know what those are, but have we really examined their role in the story? Who are the people that nourish you, that feed you, that support you? Who are the real supporting characters in your story? Who are the unsupporting characters? The people who you feel bad when you're around them. You feel like you're kind of like torn down a notch when you're around them. They make passive aggressive remarks. They don't really support you. And then, so how do you change your relationship around the unsupporting characters? And that might be something around setting boundaries. It might be something around responding differently to them. It might be something about creating a different role in your story for them. Maybe you even write them out of the story. In a TV show, they can write people out of a series anytime. Why do we not write people out of our stories that don't serve the story?
I love that. Except for on soap operas, they could write them out and then
They die and they come back.
they're back from the car accident that killed them. So, and I guess it's like that for us too, right? We do resurrect people.
We do, but we might resurrect them in a different form, or we might resurrect them in a way that we have a different relationship with them, that we are doing something different.
What is the role of core beliefs in the stories we tell ourselves?
Yeah, huge. That's this process in the workbook. Some of the core beliefs that people walk around with are, oh, I can't trust anyone, or I can't trust anyone in an intimate relationship, or people will always leave me, or I need to perform to be loved. I could just go on all day about the kinds of core beliefs that people come in with, right? And so it's really, but I don't think that we think about our own. I think it's really easy to see them in other people. Like, you can probably see them about the people that you're closest to, but they might not see them as clearly. So in the workbook, there are specific exercises that help people to really drill down to, what are these core beliefs? What are these core narratives that are driving my story that I'm not even aware of? So often we stay in the content, like, here's what's going on in my marriage. Here's what's going on in, my career. Here's what's going on with me as a parent, whatever it might be. As opposed to, I'm also carrying around this core belief about me as a person that is impacting all of these different areas of content. So it's getting down into the process.
I'm asked a lot about, as a therapist, do I believe in manifesting certain people into your life, or attracting certain people because of this energy? And I think what I hear you saying is, if we have this core belief of unworthiness, we do tend to operate in this space of finding someone who will make that story true for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the repetition compulsion that I write about in the book and the workbook, which is, I think a lot of people say, I didn't like being treated in this way by whoever it was when you were growing up. And so I'm going to find people, I'm going to surround myself with friends, with romantic partners, with, my surrogate family, my family when I grow up, the family I create for myself. Is going to be different. And then people end up with the same exact kinds of people. They're surrounding themselves with the same exact kinds of people. And it's confounding to them. They're like, why do I keep ending up in the same situation over and over when this is exactly the thing that I'm trying to get away from? And part of it is because unless you are aware, and that's why this workbook is so important, because unless you can drill down and see, this is the story that I'm carrying around with me, you're going to reenact that story every single time. And so that story is going to feel familiar to you. It's kind of like you see someone and you're like, oh, I'm really drawn to that person. And they seem really different from that person from your past. And yet once you get to know them, it's almost like you had radar for that person who's going to hurt you in exactly the same way that you were injured as a child. And so that's the unconscious process that's going on. And we need to make the unconscious conscious. And that's what we're trying to do in the workbook, is to say, what is this story that you're not aware of, that you are walking around with, that when you see someone, you are attracted to them because they feel so familiar to you, even though you think consciously that they're very different. And so you've got to disentangle those two things.
Okay. How does your therapy approach consider intersectional identities this keeps jumping, of your patient's audience, specifically talking about women who hold multiple marginalized identities, such as Black women or immigrant and LGBTQ women, and how are we told multiple stories about each of our identities? How do we rewrite these stories collectively or individually? I'm going to rephrase that a bit. For marginalized people, how do you shape the narratives that have been given to you, the narratives that people believe to be true, the narratives that continue to circulate? How do you exist in a world where for some folks this is true, and you have to change this inner construct of what you think about yourselves? Is that an individual thing? Is that a collective thing? How do we do that?
I don't think you can do good therapy if you don't take the cultural context of that person's life into the room with you. And I learned this, that you learn this in graduate school, but you don't really get it, I think, or I didn't really get it. I know a lot of fellow therapists did not get it. How do we take, because I think that we have this idea that if you help people to self-reflect, if you help them to see their patterns, if you help them to see how they interact with people, if you help them to look at these stories, that is enough. But it's not enough, because we're all living in a context, in a bigger societal context. And so I think, I just lost Nedra, by the way. I don't know what just happened to my Zoom screen. Is Nedra still here?
It looks like this is Maddie. It looks like she got kicked off. We'll get her back on.
Oh, okay. Would you like me to wait for her, or would you like me to continue to?
If you're, still answering a question, you can certainly continue with that while we get her back on.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. And so, I remember that I was seeing this woman. So no matter how much you learn this, I don't think you really get it until you're actually seeing people and realizing how uncomfortable you are bringing up these cultural aspects of people's lives. And I remember that I was seeing this woman who is Black, and she was like a mirror image of me, or so I thought, in every way. So we had grown up in the same place and gone to the same schools at different times, and our kids were the same ages, and we read the same things and laughed at the same things and responded to the world in very similar ways. And she was someone, sometimes you'll have patients and you're like, if I wasn't seeing them for therapy, that person would be my friend, but you can't do that, obviously. So this is one of those people. And I never talked about the fact that I was a white therapist and she was my Black client. We never talked about that difference between us. We just ignored it, both of us. And then one day she came in and She was very upset, and she had been passed over for a promotion that was very much supposed to be hers. And it had never been given to a person of color before, but she was in line for it. She had worked for it her whole career, and it was given to a white male. And it was very upsetting to her. And we had talked about, we talked about gender, but we also talked about race for the very first time. And she said to me, I never really thought about talking about that in here. And I had to confess that I didn't think about talking about it either. And it was one of these like it was like the elephant in the room that neither of us was willing to talk about. And so much of the therapy after that really brought in the context in which, we both had these lives where we grew up in the same city and we went to the same schools and all of this, but your experience of that city was this, and my experience of that city was this, and your experience of being in the dining hall where somebody says, hey, can you serve me, was very different from mine. And so it was really important that we were able to talk about that, and it really changed therapy. And I think the therapy would have been really a lost opportunity had that not come into the room. So now I'm very, very conscious of that. But I'm embarrassed telling this story, but I'm only telling this story because I feel like people need to hear these stories. They need to hear the stories of people where you say, wait a minute, I think I'm really aware of this, but you're not bringing it into the room at all. And you're waiting for your patient to do that, or maybe even not waiting for the patient. You don't even realize that this needs to be in the room because you're so blind to it because you think, look how similar we are. And yet, of course, two people are going to have very different experiences, and they're also going to have different experiences based on race, religion, socioeconomic status, everything, you name it. And to not bring that into the room is really, you're missing something very important in the therapy.
In terms of the book, what lessons do you hope that readers will get from using the workbook?
I hope that they'll get a clear understanding of their role in the story of their lives. I feel like so many times we're kind of sleepwalking through our lives. We think we're being intentional about our lives, but we don't realize how we are writing the story every day. And maybe we're writing it in a way that we would choose not to if we were more aware of the fact that we were writing it or how we were writing it. And so I really want people to be very clear. I said in my TED talk that, there's a story that gets written about all of us at the end of our lives, and that's called an obituary. And that we shouldn't really wait for that story. We don't want that, we don't want that story to be written about us where we didn't really get a chance to write our story. So in this time that we have while we're here, I want everybody to be very conscious of every day. How are you writing your story? What is your role in it? If you want to edit your story, how can you do that? Really, you get to choose what kind of life you want to have to some degree. There are constraints that we all have. So it's not some kind of like, there is this kind of, there's this sector of self-help that I don't subscribe to, which is like anything is possible. I don't believe that. I don't believe that as a therapist, and maybe that makes me sort of like a downer therapist, but I actually think it's very hopeful because I think that it looks at reality. It looks at sort of like the reality of people's lives and what we do have control over and what we don't have control over, and what we can change and what we can't change, and how do we make sense of the things and live with the things that we can't change, or how do we have a different relationship with the things that we can't change. So rewriting your story is not like, you can just, write the story of your life in any way that you want. It's you write a really realistic version of your life. And I think that helps us to live our lives in the most intentional and meaningful way.
Okay. For the therapists who are here, how do they take some of this editing your story and changing your life into the therapeutic space? Can a therapist use this workbook as a tool to help clients?
Yeah, in fact, it was a lot of therapists. So it was a lot of just people who read the book, but there were also therapists saying like, is there a workbook? Because so many of their clients would come in and say, I want to do more with this book, or they would bring in the book. And it was really helpful to the therapy, but it would also be helpful, they were saying, if they had something that would give them something to work on in between. Like if they were like, do you have any worksheets Do you have any worksheets I can hand out at the end of the session? And so I think this is really helpful to be able to have clients work on the workbook and then bring in some of what they've worked on to talk about in the session, because it will spark other conversations. It will also solidify a lot of the work that you as a therapist have probably been doing with that client, but maybe having this dual approach of they're doing some writing and reflecting in between, and you're doing the work in the room with them. And then to have those two things aligned can be really powerful.
I find that books and workbooks are wonderful for accountability and having something to talk about and do in between sessions. It's a wonderful tool to help people, particularly those who are like on, how many sessions do I have to come? Okay, get this workbook and maybe 6. You know, we'll do the work, we'll talk about the workbook, do the work, that sort of thing, because there are some people who do not desire to be in therapy long term, and they want like this, like, what can I do? And just being able to refer them to some tools that can help change their life and work with you so they can speed up that process for themselves can be really helpful. And I think narrative therapy is a wonderful approach to being able to help. There was someone who asked if narrative therapy, how evidence-based, what are the statistics, that sort of thing. And I can't remember the website, but for many types of therapy, whether it is acceptance and commitment, narrative therapy, there is a website that will break down each approach and the type of issues that it is best used with. So for narrative therapy, they may say depression, anxiety, or, whatever. And so it sort of breaks that down, that this approach fits best with people dealing with these sort of issues. But what I will say is, I think that approach is really important as a therapist, but one of the things that we know to be the most important is the relationship with your therapist. So I can go in and talk about strawberry type therapy, right? And I'm saying that because I'm looking at some strawberries. But if you trust me, we have a healthy relationship, you will grow from this type of therapy.
Yeah, so absolutely. I cite that study in Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, that more than your therapeutic orientation, more than the number of years of training you have, all of those things matter, but nothing matters as much. Study after study backs this up as the relationship you have with your therapist. And so what I'm trying to do in the workbook is I want to I can't be there with people as they're doing the workbook, but I want them to feel felt. I want them to feel held while they are doing the workbook. And so the tone of the workbook, it's very much, I am talking to you. I am talking to you the way I would talk to you if you were sitting right in front of me, if we were here together and I was holding the space for you. So I try to hold the space in the workbook, and I'm very much, just talking people through it. It's almost like we're having a conversation. And then I'm saying, okay, so we've just talked about this, and now let's try this. And how did you feel about this? And now let's reflect on what that was like for you to do this. And then if you felt this, let's talk about this. So it's very much that sense of holding space for people. And I as much as you can communicate that in a workbook, and I think people got to know me a little bit through the original book, I hope that will help people. It's not like a dry clinical workbook at all. It's very warm and compassionate.
So is the workbook, would you consider this more of a self-help book?
I think it's, very much a book where you can be in conversation with yourself, but with the support of a therapist. Mm-hmm. So you have a therapist who's supporting you through that process, but I really want people to start listening to themselves. I want them to listen to those inner voices that get drowned out by all the noise out there, that they don't even know what that inner voice says anymore because they can't hear it. Or if they hear it, they kind of dismiss it because all the other voices are just too loud. I really want people to have a different relationship with themselves. And you can do that, I think, really easily through story. It's not prescriptive, it's not like, here are 10 bullet points and here are some affirmations to write on your wall. It's not that. It's very much a process of, who am I? How do I feel about these things? Have I ever even sat down and asked myself these questions? What are the questions that I didn't even know I should be asking myself, or I could be asking myself?
Hmm. There's a question here regarding someone making negative statements, labeling themselves in a negative way. And perhaps these things are true. Like, it says that they're fat or they're overweight. How do you help a client through that process when the narrative that they're telling themselves is true? Like, how will the book help with those sort of things?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because so often what happens is people come in and they're so self-critical. And I remember that I had this client come in and she did not realize how self-critical she was, but I could hear it in everything she said. And I said, listen, I want you to go home and I want you to write down everything that this voice that you're not really paying attention to, except that you are, kind of like the TV's in the background and you think you're not paying attention to it, but you're actually hearing it. I want you to write down everything, listen to that voice, pay attention to it, and write down everything that it tells you, that you say to yourself in the course of a week, and then come back and we'll talk about it. And she came back the next week, she had done the assignment, and she had just started to cry as she was reading this. She said, I am such a bully to myself. And I didn't even realize that. And there were things like she was typing an email and she made a typo, and the voice in her head immediately said, you're so stupid. Right? If somebody else made that same typo, she would not think that person is stupid. It would never occur to her. Or she would catch a reflection in the mirror and say, you look terrible. I think when you notice things about yourself that maybe you want to change and you don't have compassion, like maybe you're saying, I want to get healthier. I'm overweight and I want to get healthier, right? That's different from, you're so fat, in that sort of like critical way. And by the way, the word fat shouldn't have any sort of connotation to it. It's like someone's thin, someone's fat, someone's, whatever. It just, we have these connotations that are in the culture. So separating out the culture. But if you in your heart of hearts say, I really want to be healthier, I would feel better if I lost some weight, that's a very different conversation to have with yourself than, these kind of self-flagellating conversations about, like the judgment and the criticism and the cruelty, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I always say to people, like when I'm giving talks, I'll say to people, like, show of hands, who's the person that you talk to most in the course of your life? Is it your partner? Lots of hands. Is it your parent? Is it your best friend? Is it your sibling? But the person that we talk to most in the course of our lives is ourselves. And what we say to ourselves isn't always kind or true or useful. So I think that it has to meet those three criteria. So maybe it's true that this person is overweight. That might be true, but is it kind? And is it useful? It might be useful to say to yourself, yes, I want to lose some weight. Is it kind, the way you talk to yourself? So it has to meet those three criteria. Is it kind? Is it true? Is it useful? If it doesn't meet those three criteria, fix the one or two or three that it doesn't meet.
Thank you for that. I just want to show the workbook one more time. And the workbook can be purchased at Amazon, Bookshop, where you can buy it from independent retailers. Of course, any local bookstore, any place online, pretty much anywhere that sells books will have this workbook. Lori, can you tell people where they can find you and find out more about your work?
Sure. They can find me at my website, which is lorigottlieb.com. They can listen to my Dear Therapist podcast every Tuesday. A new episode went up today. Wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever. They can watch my TED Talk if they want to do that as something to assist them with the workbook, because it's on the same theme of stories. They can, of course, read the original book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. And I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and those kinds of things. And I want to encourage all of you, by the way, as well, to follow Nedra's work. Nedra, can you tell people a little bit about where they can find you and all of that, because you're also very active on social media, and that people can also get your books everywhere.
Yes, I want to mention one more thing for you that you forgot, your column.
Yes, and I have a column called Dear
Yes.
Therapist in the Atlantic. Yes.
Yes, and go back and read as many as you can. Take a Saturday. They are all so good. So please check out her column as well. I am Nedra Tawwab. I have a book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace. That's it right there. And the book is about setting boundaries with yourself and with others. I am most present on Instagram at Nedra Tawwab. I have a website where you can find tools and resources, quizzes about boundaries and relationships. And my website is nedratawwab.com.
Well, Nedra, thank you so much for having this conversation today. I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and it's such an honor to be able to meet you virtually, but still. And I want to thank everybody for coming today. I think it's such a great experience for all of us in the field to be able to talk to one another, people who are therapy adjacent, to, you know, come and join and have these conversations. We talked about accessibility earlier, and I think that both you and I, Nedra, just really want to make emotional health accessible to everyone. So I hope you all enjoy the workbook, and I would love to hear, post on social media, wherever, how it's going for you as you go through it.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Grab the workbook, share it with your friends, with your clients. It is wonderful. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Well, Nedra, it was so great to meet you, and I hope we can work together again in some way.
Yes, this was wonderful. I had a little snap out, but I got back in there.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Thank you for figuring that out so quick.
Yes.